Howdy doody everybody. Today we're covering weird stuff in Kentucky and considering strange folklore that suggests everything from a train colliding with a UFO to the idea that there are people with blue blood living in the hills of the state. All of this has led me to believe your state is proper strange, but I mean this in a good way. Now, before we get started, I just want to say thank you for tuning in and let you know that if you want to see my little channel continue to grow, the best possible thing you can do for me is subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and most importantly, watch until the end. None of this will ever cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. With this in mind, come with me today and let's see what Kentucky has in store in the weird department. Now, having spent the majority of my upbringing in Tennessee, I'm well acquainted with the legends of the Blue Fugates, or the Blue People of Kentucky. And usually, when these individuals are discussed, they're discussed in the context of folklore, usually referring to people that live in the quiet Appalachian parts of Kentucky that are kind of blue, like Blue Man Group Blue, dwelling in the hills. Now, everyone knows that this is simply an urban legend, and that the strangest things you'll find in Kentucky are a replica of Noah's Ark and the nut selection at Buc-ee's outside of Bowling Green, right? Right? Well, maybe not. In reality, there really is a group of people living in Kentucky that have a rare genetic blood disorder named methemoglobinemia that causes their skin to have a slightly blue tint. To be clear, this disease doesn't only manifest in bluish skin, it's actually sort of sad, as it can result in the manifestation of heart abnormalities and seizures, which are caused by an elevated amount of methemoglobin in some cases, though it seems the Blue People of Kentucky were spared in this respect. Now, the story of where this disorder comes from, at least in Kentucky, starts with two individuals, Martin Fugate, what the Blue Fugates is named for, who was a French orphan, and Elizabeth Smith. They were both settlers near Hazard, Kentucky, a city in the eastern portion of the state, and they married in 1820, and both just happened to be carriers of the recessive methemoglobinemia, or simpler said, MET-H gene, which I need to just say that from here on out. And because of this, 4 of their 7 children had slightly blue-tinted skin. It's worth noting, it's said that Martin was also in fact sort of blue, but Elizabeth was a red-headed woman with pale skin and no blue tint. Now, being a small community, these children went on to reproduce locally, in a gene pool that was, well, limited to say the least. And that's because of the lack of local transportation infrastructure. See trains. There weren't any trains running through this area. And this led to many descendants of Martin and Elizabeth being born with MET-H. In other words, and this isn't to stigmatize, but the Blue People were often marrying one of their own first cousins. So small was this community that they were marrying pretty much the closest folks to them, usually their own kin. Fugates would marry Fugates, more often than not, and sometimes the local Combses, Smiths, Richies, and Stacys would join in the party. In a quote by one Dennis Stacy, a coal miner from the region, he said, "It was hard to get out, so they intermarried." And then, tracing a chart showing his genealogy, he recounted, "If you'll notice, I'm kin to myself." Now, luckily for the so-called Blue People, these individuals, despite being relatively blue in skin, were also relatively healthy, and most of them lived normal, healthy lives. It's said that the bluest descendant of the family, Luna Stacy, had 13 children and lived to the age of 84. Apparently, as facilities became more modern in the area, some of these Blue People were born as babies in modern hospitals, which surprised the doctors far more than their parents, and occasionally tests were even run to try to determine why the skin of these newborns were blue, but hospitals were never able to determine a cause. Some of them, while growing up, would even mostly lose their blue skin, only displaying it when they were frustrated or cold. Well into the 20th century, this group of so-called Blue People lived near Troublesome Creek and Ball Creek in Kentucky, and eventually this phenomenon came to the attention of a hematologist, one Madison Cowan III, who studied their condition and figured out why they were blue. Madison was a worker at the University of Kentucky's Lexington Medical Center in the 1960s. Apparently, as a kid, he would occasionally tromp around the hills of Kentucky looking for the blue people during the summer. And one day, while sipping on a whiskey sour, he remembered these good old days, and eventually he met someone through the American Heart Association clinic in Hazard, one Ruth Pendergrass, who's described as a great big nurse, and Ruth was trying to stir up interest in the local community. She apparently came across a dark blue woman who'd once walked into the county health department on a cold afternoon looking for a blood test. Apparently, folks thought she was having a heart attack, but this woman was not concerned at all about her skin tone. This chance occurrence was all that was needed to bring the legend of the blue people to Ruth Pendergrass, who would recount this tale to Madison and break the case wide open. Apparently, here it was also learned that while this disease was just everyday life to many of the so-called blue people, some of them were also still embarrassed of their condition, and at the very least, this blue community was curious about what was going on with them. Surmising that this condition was related to a similar condition among Native Alaskans, Madison, after some research, concluded that this blue skin was a result of an oxygen deficiency in red blood cells due to the lack of an enzyme named diaphragmase, causing blood to be slightly brown and skin to therefore turn slightly blue. The way this works is that in a normal skin tone individual, hemoglobin is converted to something called methemoglobin very slowly, and the enzyme diaphragmase I mentioned will convert some of the methemoglobin back into hemoglobin. But the lack of diaphragmase in these people's bodies resulted in an excess of methemoglobin in the blood, which is essentially a non-functional form of the red hemoglobin that carries oxygen in our blood. Additionally, this condition wouldn't have popped up if not for interbreeding, as to get this condition you have to receive the recessive trait from both parents. Having only one gene for this condition would not allow it to pass to a child. Now, ultimately, Madison actually treated these families with methylene blue, which restored their skin to a pink color within minutes. They were then given a supply of methylene blue tablets to take daily, and boom, they were no longer blue people for the rest of their lives. From what I can tell, one Benjamin Stacy, who was born in 1975, was the last known proper blue person in Kentucky, only exhibiting slight blue tinges on his lips and fingertips when he became cold or frustrated. With coal mining coming to the community and railroads becoming established in the area, the so-called blue fugates began to slowly trickle out of their community, marrying other people and diluting the blue-skinned recessive trait as they married into other families. But still, out there in some of us, who knows, maybe you or me, this gene that will turn our skin slightly blue remains, waiting to awaken and make us ever so slightly more blue than the average bear. So this case is known by a few names: the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter, sometimes the Hopkinsville Goblins case, or occasionally the Kelly-Greenman case. Regardless, this is a case of a close encounter with goblin-like creatures or maybe aliens in Christian County, Kentucky, near the communities of Kelly and Hopkinsville, that occurred on the night and early morning of August 21st to 22nd in 1955. Now, according to the individuals present, what happened here is that a family essentially got together in Kelly, Kentucky. There were men, women, and children present, and one of the men there, one Billy Ray Taylor, was visiting from Pennsylvania and went outside to the farm's well to grab some water when he suddenly saw a light falling through the sky, a circular-shaped object that hovered in the air for a little bit as it drew near, then rested in a nearby gully. Of course, Taylor was pretty concerned about this, and he went back in to get a shotgun, as you do in the woods of Kentucky when you see something strange. And he walked back outside only to see a creature he could describe as goblin-like, with huge eyes, and hands that were disproportionately large. He was also wearing some sort of metal plate while approaching him. Now again, as you do, Taylor ran inside to grab backup, and afterwards he was joined by one Lucky Sutton, who had a shotgun as well. Also, it's worth noting, while grabbing Lucky Sutton, who was apparently unlucky for being in this situation, one of these critters appeared in the window, and Sutton blasted his window to pieces, shooting at it. I imagine they thought this was the end of it, so they went outside to see what they'd killed, only for Taylor to suddenly feel a hand grabbing at him from the roof, grabbing his hair. It was then that they saw one of the creatures was in a tree, and the other was on the roof, grabbing at Taylor. Sudden once again shot at one of the creatures, the one in the tree, and apparently it knocked this creature out of the tree, at which point once it hit the ground, it just kind of got right back up. These goblins, apparently after this confrontation, disappeared for a while, and for some reason it was at this opportunity that, rather than escape, they decided to barricade themselves inside and wait for a chance to escape. FYI, it said this whole event took upwards of about 4 hours, and at some point, around 11 p.m. on August 21st, the family was able to escape, and before long, the 5 adults and 7 kids arrived at the Hopkinsville police station, claiming small alien creatures were attacking their farmhouse and that they'd been holding them off for 4 hours. They were essentially begging the police for help to fight aliens. Now, Elmer Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor, 2 of the adults here, claimed the creatures were short, dark figures that kept popping up in their doorways and looking in their windows. It's worth noting that the Kentucky New Era, a paper reporting on this incident, said that there were 12 to 15 goblins present, and it's worth noting this was never actually a reported number, but it has stuck a lot on other YouTube channels and reporting about this event. Now, regardless, the tale being told by the family made the police say to themselves, maybe we should check this out so that citizens of our municipality don't get themselves shot in a firefight with ghosts. So they sent a whole brigade to the farm. This included 5 state troopers, 4 city police officers, 3 deputy sheriffs, and 4 military police officers from Fort Campbell. Keep in mind, this is 16 armed men that went to the Sutton farmhouse in Kelly, so maybe they were expecting a fight. They, of course, upon arriving, found nothing but a home that had been absolutely smoked with bullet holes in their windows and door screens, but they found no flying saucer, no goblins, and just a whole bunch of damage. And then they left. Apparently, the critters returned again that night for a while, at around 3:30 in the morning on August 22nd, but otherwise, from what I can tell, this was the last that anybody saw of these creatures, but certainly not the last we'll hear of them in the media. So now that we're here, let's go through a few details about this case. To start, these creatures were never described as green by witnesses. They referred to them as goblins. But news articles decided to latch on to the Little Green Men title for the drama, I suppose, or maybe just because of the popularity of Little Green Men in media at the time. The Sutton family estimated that the creatures were about 2 to 4 feet tall and that they had large pointed ears, hands like claws, and eyes that glowed yellow. Their legs were also apparently very thin and sort of lanky. To be clear, there is no physical evidence that was ever collected regarding this case. I'm not saying that there wasn't any physical evidence, but there certainly wasn't any collected by police, at least not that they're admitting. It's also worth noting most media claimed that no alcohol was involved in this episode, nor did the police report any intoxication related to this incident. But psychologists that have studied the case generally think the behavior in accounts of this case indicate intoxication. So in terms of what truly happened here, skeptics generally think that this whole episode was an effect of excitement, and that they saw owls, meteors, and other natural phenomena that combined to create quite the ordeal at the Sutton family household on this evening in 1955. People generally lean towards the aliens actually being misidentified eagle owls or great horned owls. Frankly, the behavior of these creatures and their size do align with the little goblins pretty well. Owls are nocturnal. They fly without making hardly any noise. They have yellow eyes, and they also are known to aggressively defend their nests, one of which may very well have been near the well that was being approached by Taylor that evening. Additionally, there were sightings of a meteor around the time this occurred, possibly explaining Billy Ray Taylor's claim that he saw a bright light streak across the sky and disappear beyond a tree line some distance from the house, that he interpreted as an alien craft. Additionally, many think it's curious that these creatures apparently retreated to the trees by floating through the air when they were shot at. Perhaps the silence of an owl's flight was taken to be some sort of floating motion. It's also worth noting there was a green glowing light noticed to be in the woods during this whole ordeal whose source couldn't be determined throughout the event. However, foxfire fungus is native to the region where this occurred, and foxfire, if you're not aware, is a fungus that glows kind of greenish at night, so it's possible this could be the glowing light they were talking about. Admittedly, this event's legacy is, well, sort of controversial, if you can't tell. Many consider it one of the best documented cases of UFOs in the history of ever. Others think it's bogus, but regardless, it did influence one man, someone you might be familiar with. His name is Steven Spielberg. And upon the success of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a sequel was demanded of Spielberg. And one tale that caught Spielberg's attention was that of the Hopkinsville Goblins. Spielberg even went so far as to write a treatment based on the incident, asking John Sayles to make him a script for a movie named Night Skies based on the event. This movie was actually pretty fleshed out. We know a whole lot about it. The aliens attacking the home had different personalities in the movie, so to speak. One was evil, and by extending his long, bony finger, this one, named Scar, could kill a man. Another was named Buddy. He was nice, and while it doesn't say what his finger did, I bet you anything, his finger, when extended, could heal the wounds caused by Scar. Now, Spielberg began to have doubts about this movie, and in this period of doubt, he shared the movie with one Melissa Matheson, a screenwriter, who found the character Buddy incredibly endearing, and decided she would take Buddy and run with him, making him the focal point of a movie about a sympathetic alien and a small child that developed a unique bond. And this movie, what was the script she wrote for it called? Well, she called it E.T. and Me. Now, finally, where do I land on this case? To be clear, I'm not saying they saw aliens, but as a person that has at one point sort of been redneck adjacent, you cannot in good faith convince me that some rural Kentucky folk did not know what an owl was. All of this being said, the creatures did seem sort of owl-like, and I'm not generally convinced that lights in the sky landing on Earth are always indicative of aliens. Also, a lot of Southerners did spot a meteor on this evening, which may very well have been what was seen on this farm, at least in terms of the light in the sky part. I don't know if he saw an alien craft actually landing just beyond the property. I don't know. I'm not saying no, I'm not saying yes, but regardless, I want to hear what you think about this case down in the comments. Do you think they saw aliens? Do you think they saw owls? Do you think they maybe drank a little too much? Let me know. It was a clear sky day over Olympia Springs in Bath County, Kentucky at the farmhouse of one Alan Crouch on March 3rd of 1876, and Alan Crouch's wife, one Mrs. Crouch of course, was making soap on her porch, and then she saw something. Something fell from the sky, and in this case, no, it wasn't an alien, or even an alien spacecraft, or even a meteor, or even something reasonable like precipitation. Rather, it was a piece of meat that fell to the ground. So yes, on a clear sky day, a beautiful day to be precise, in March, literal meat rained down from the sky, falling like large snowflakes, according to Mrs. Crouch, which I take to mean they were well distributed. These pieces of meat were about 2 by 2 inches, and at least one was about 4 times this size. The meat was red meat, perhaps a piece of beef, but maybe a lamb or a deer, according to some individuals who, well, tasted the meat. And this is extra gross, not just because they tasted meat that fell out of the sky, but also because of other things, which we'll get to in a second. Other opinions were that this was something called nostoc, a substance, also called star jelly, or troll's butter, which is actually a genus of cyanobacteria that sometimes grows symbiotically with the tissues of plants and sort of looks like mucus, and after rain it swells up into a big gelatin-like mass. Now, keep in mind, this was 1876, so proper scientific investigation like we might do today was not necessarily an option, but despite this, they sent the meat samples to the Newark Scientific Association, and a doctor, Alan McLean Hamilton, stated that the meat was either lung tissue from a horse or a human infant, with these two organ structures being pretty similar. Hence why it could have been gross that some people ate some of it. 7 other analyses suggested the meat was lung tissue, cartilage, or muscle. And it's worth noting, I don't think these 7 extra analyses suggested the meat was that of the human variety. Now, as for explanations of how this occurred, some locals suggest that this was meat vomited up by buzzards, and one Dr. Louis D. Castenbein presented this theory in the contemporary Louisville Medical Journal as an explanation for the variety of meat types found. Now, I didn't know this animal fact, but apparently when vultures feel threatened or quickly need to run from something, they'll vomit, like a whole group of vultures will vomit. So this is certainly a possibility. The favorite explanation of the farmers that owned the land that the meat landed on was that this was a sign from God, though. To me, it seems pretty cut and dry that the culprit here was vultures, but regardless, I cannot imagine sitting on my porch and seeing red meat rain down in front of me. So, to be clear, I'm not making a religious stance here. Whatever your religious beliefs, that's none of my business. But what I will scoff at is the price of this attraction, because at $99.99, $100, I could buy like 6 to 7 King James Bibles and probably learn a whole lot more about God in a factual way than I could from a so-called replica of Noah's Ark. Anyways, we're not here to talk about my ridiculous budgeting prowess, but we're here to talk about the Ark Encounter. The Ark Encounter is a 510-foot long, 85-foot wide, and 51-foot high attraction that lies between Cincinnati and Lexington off of I-75 in Williamstown, Kentucky. Again, $99.99 for an adult, which to me is more than I'd pay for my college football team to win a national championship. Well, that is unless I could bet on it. But essentially, this place is the centerpiece for a large Christian theme park that's based on the narrative that the flood in Genesis was a factual historical event. I'm not here to debate if this is true or not, I'm just telling you what this is based upon. Now, this attraction is operated by an organization named Answers in Genesis, which is essentially a group that spreads the gospel of young Earth creationism, a belief that Earth and all life on Earth were created instantly about 6 to 10,000 years ago, aka that the scientific interpretation of Earth's age, among other things, are incorrect, and their reasoning for this lies in their interpretation of the Bible's accounts of events and a handful of findings that haven't yet been explained by scientific inquiry. The motivation for this site's building was in part to dispel doubts that Noah could have fit 2 of every kind of animal onto a 500-foot-long ark. Among the interesting ideas suggested by this attraction is that humans and dinosaurs coexisted, for instance. And while this attraction was being built, they apparently thought it would be a huge boon to the local economy, and controversially, they received tax incentives from the municipality, which drew concerns over the lack of separation between church and state. Additionally, this organization, when hiring, required potential Ark Encounter employees to sign a statement of faith as a condition of their employment, which many have called discriminatory. Again, not going into the weeds here, I'm just stating factual points of controversy. Now, if despite all of this, you do decide to go spend $100 for a visit, you'll be met with 132 bays inside of this faux ark, distributed throughout 3 decks of the ship. In these bays, you'll see various animals that were supposedly on the ark, interpretations of Noah's workshop and blacksmithing station, and apparently there are even displays aboard that appear to depict the world before the flood, showing things such as a priest sacrificing a child to some unnamed snake god, and people fighting dinosaurs and giants in gladiatorial combat, which I should emphasize they are suggesting actually happened. To be frank though, the thought of fighting giants and dinosaurs at the same time is pretty metal, if you ask me. Otherwise, there are some other interesting things about this business and the area it inhabits. For instance, there's a 1.25 mile radius around the site that is a tax increment financing district, aka in this area, 75% of sales and property tax in the district will go back to Ark Encounter for the next 30 years. Also, employees in this district pay 2% employment tax that goes directly to Ark Encounter. In other words, they get tax money from their own employees, which is kind of taboo if you ask me. But maybe this happens more often than I know. Also, apparently a wave of funding came for Ark Encounter after the famous debate between Kinham and Bill Nye the Science Guy in February of 2014. Yeah, remember that? Feel old yet? I sure do. Finally, the Ark was originally planned to be held together with wood pegs, but given it is in fact a building and not a boat, it was required to use a bunch of metal plates and bolts to connect the wood. Ultimately, though, its construction has made it the largest timber frame structure in the USA, which is pretty cool if you ask me. Ultimately, this attraction opened on July 7th of 2016, which corresponds to Genesis 7:7, and for what it's worth, despite the controversy and the fact that many disagree with its pseudoscientific interpretation of the origin of the Earth and humanity's history, it has brought tons of tourism to the local area, and really propped up the local economy, altogether seeming to mostly benefit the local communities. So I guess in some respects, it's probably better something like this open up near you than a Walmart. Now, the general opinion of this Ark Encounter attraction by the public seems to be that of a religious organization that's created and touts as true their own alternative to science, in something that's supposed to appear like a museum portraying factual events. Again, let's be clear, I don't care what your beliefs are. I have nothing against you for your beliefs, and I'm just telling you factual points about this museum, other than the fact that I think that fighting dinosaurs and giants is pretty metal. Regardless, by most modern standards, some of the practices surrounding this business are a bit taboo to say the least. So there's a story that takes place in Paintsville, Kentucky that tells of something fantastical. A train getting into an accident with a flying saucer. Now, I'll be the first to admit, this story isn't necessarily well documented, but from what I can tell, it has permeated the state and local community, and perhaps due to the historical importance of the railroad in this area, the community has really latched onto the story, so I'd be remiss if I didn't share it. With this in mind, let's get into this fantastic tale. So it was January 14th of 2002 at 2:47 a.m. in Paintsville, Kentucky, and while working a coal train going from Russell to Shelbyana, a train was reported to have struck an unknown floating or hovering object. Apparently at the time the collision occurred, the watches of those aboard froze, and thus they knew the time this collision occurred very accurately. Additionally, the electrical systems on the train went crazy, and apparently as they were approaching, they saw lights along the track. They thought this was another train coming on the adjacent track, and so they killed their lights as not to blind the other crew as they rounded the corner to approach this other train, and then the onboard computer began to flash in and out. The speed recordings went in and out, and alarm bells aboard started to ring. Also, both locomotives driving the train died. Suddenly, they saw an object ahead of them that they were bound to collide with. These objects were stopped hovering aboard the tracks with apparent lights, which the crew suggested to be searchlights, trained on a river down below them. The crew suggested maybe they were looking for something. Anyways, the objects were metallic silver, like aluminum foil, and had colored lights at the bottom and in the middle. They were about 18 to 20 feet in length, maybe 10 feet high. Now, given the engines died, the train made little noise, and the first object on the track didn't respond in time to get out of the way, and the train hit it at about 30 miles an hour while carrying 16,000 tons behind it. The object apparently skipped backwards and sliced a chunk out of their coal cars and trailing unit. They weren't able to stop for about another mile and a half, but luckily their emergency brakes had initiated upon their power loss. They immediately notified their dispatcher right after the collision. Now, the rear locomotive was apparently absolutely wrecked by this, and it was smoking. The second two cars were able to hold the rails, but they were also absolutely smashed. In the state, they were just barely able to limp the train to Paintsville Yard, arriving at about 5:15 a.m., and when they got there, the overhead lights that were usually on were darkened, and unusual vehicles were parked near the end of the track. They pulled to a stop and began to unload themselves from the train, and it was then that it sounded like army workers or some similar orderly group were attending to the train. Doors were slamming, folks were running around in weird outfits, and suddenly lights were shining on the train. The only thing missing were railroad officials. My understanding is this is who would usually be there after a railroad accident. Apparently, the people that were there were asking lots of questions to those aboard, and even gave them medical tests. The conductor's cell phone was also confiscated. The smashed cars were apparently quickly grabbed and put under a huge tent, and the operators aboard were told to be silent about this event. The operators on the train were then drug tested and went through more questioning, and then they were put back to work as if nothing happened. When they returned to Paintsville a short while later, the engines, cars, tents, and people were all gone. From some digging, it looks like CSX Railroad Company runs the area around Paintsville, and also did so at the time of this incident. So maybe if you're trying to dig further into this incident, look there. I should note, I did look deeper, and I didn't find anything. No incident reports, nothing. So I'll be honest, this could very well just be folklore, as the reporting on this event seems to be solely from a whistleblower that came to the National UFO Reporting Center, from what I can tell. But despite this, the story looks to have blown up, and on the Kentucky subreddits, they appear passionate about this tale. The USS Sachem started its journey in 1901 in Wilmington, Delaware. It was intended to be a luxury steam yacht being built by the Pussy and Jones Company, a major shipbuilding company, until its closing in 1959. It was ordered under the name of Celt by one John Rogers Maxwell, a Manhattan businessman who was the chairman of the executive committee of the Central Railroad of New Jersey and the president of Atlas Portland Cement Company, the company that supplied cement to build the Panama Canal and the Empire State Building. In other words, this man was swimming in money. The boat was large, too, at 186 feet long overall and 170 feet at waterline, as well as being 24 feet wide and 12.5 feet deep, as well as 25 feet high without the masts and smokestack. It was beautiful, having been designed by the famous yacht designer, one Henry C. Winteringham. Inside, there were 2 deck houses made of carved mahogany wood and 2 masts made from Oregon pine. There were also furnished and accessorized staterooms aboard that were also finished in mahogany with bathrooms within them. These rooms housed cooks, crews, guests, and of course, the captain, whose room was located on the upper deck. The boat was powered by a 4-cylinder triple expansion steam engine, which was fed by 2 Almy water tube coal boilers, delivering 1,200 shaft horsepower, which could propel it to speeds of 15 knots or about 17 miles an hour. This yacht even had plumbing and electricity with fans, lighting, and an icebox in every room, as well as all of the furniture you'd expect in a bedroom. After about 5 months of construction, the Celt was christened and launched on April 12, 1902. Now, this wasn't John Maxwell's first rodeo with yachts. Far from it. He was a member of many yacht clubs and had owned at least a dozen boats before this time. This boat, to him, was a pleasure craft and a tender for his sailing yachts, as well as a sort of summer home. This was also part of his racing fleet. Maxwell apparently loved this yacht, and as late as 1907, it could be seen at many of his sailing races. But as we know, humans are not immortal, and Maxwell died from cerebral apoplexy on December 10th of 1910 at his home in Brooklyn. This was the end of the ship's life as a racing yacht, and Maxwell's widow would sell the yacht to one Manton Bradley Metcalf Sr. of New York, who named this boat Sachem and continued to tour the New York waters in it. Metcalf, of course, was also filthy stinking rich, and he had a mansion along the New Jersey coast. His occupation was as a major player in the New England textile industry and as an art collector, and as you might expect, his family was opulent and known to live a lavish lifestyle. Now, this is where the Sachem's life sort of changed. World War I would begin in 1914, and a boat like the Sachem was just what the U.S. military was looking for. See, as a bit of fun history, if you didn't know, Germany was keen on blocking any supplies going to Britain from the United States early in the war in hopes of starving their economy and maybe even the British people. Their plan to do this was to deploy a ton of U-boats throughout the Atlantic, with the directive to sink any ships suspected of carrying supplies to the Allied forces. The USA, of course, was aware of this and needed a plan, seeing as the contemporary supply ships were relatively slow in velocity and maneuverability, and this plan came in the form of private yachts. Remember, we mentioned a ton of yacht racing here. Yachts were being used by the US military instead of supply ships because they were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable, and U-boats just couldn't keep up with them. The Sachem was one of the yachts requisitioned by the Navy because of this, and on July 3rd of 1917, it was renamed the USS Sachem SP-192, which stood for Section Patrol, indicating this was a patrol craft. Now, in doing this, the USS Sachem was equipped with proper navigation equipment. It had its mast removed, in addition to being equipped with depth charge racks and defensive armaments, including deck guns, 37mm guns, and LMGs, and it was placed in service on August 19th of 1917. The Sachem's directive was to patrol the east coast of the USA, all the way down to the Keys and the Caribbean. Notably, during this work, Sachem picked up an interesting guest you may have heard of, too, Thomas Edison. From August to October of 1917, Edison would live aboard the ship in New York and Florida, conducting naval research and developing products from collision mats to kite rudders, with hopes to develop torpedo detection systems and ship camouflaging systems, which, from what I can tell, never actually panned out. Now, during World War I, the Sachem, lucky for it and its crew, never actually saw combat or even a U-boat, and Edison's funding ended, so he left it behind. They returned the boat to Metcalf, who quickly sold it to one Ronald Roland Leslie Taylor, a Philly-born banker. Taylor owned the yacht until 1932, and then he sold it during the Great Depression, due to the economic turmoil he was faced with, selling it for a small fraction of its value to one Captain Jacob Jake Marden of Brooklyn, a charter fisherman, who converted it to a party fishing boat, an at the time large industry. With Jake, the Sachem sailed the New York and New Jersey coasts, and people could board it for a fee of $2. Right here is a fun photo of Jake literally preparing to shoot a shark from the upper deck of the Sachem in 1932 during one of these parties. Dude seems like he must have been a hoot. Also, more fun, here's an ad for the Sachem at the time when it was party time with Captain Jake. Apparently, during this time, the boat was well known to be among the largest and fastest boats in all the region, and it sold fish to many contemporary restaurants, hopefully with the bullet shavings taken out of them. It was around this time, by the way, that the ship's engine was replaced with a diesel engine that was a more modern 7-cylinder Fairbanks Morse 37D14. That's the engine that's still in the boat today, and it's one of the last of its kind in the world. It was massive at 20 tons and made 805 shaft horsepower, and this actually slowed down the boat by 3 to 4 miles an hour at top speed, as you might expect from the 400 horsepower drop. Now, until about 1941, the Sachem served Captain Jake, but, well, you're probably aware of what happened in December of 1941. Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese in Hawaii to prevent the Americans from interfering with Japanese military actions planned in Southeast Asia, and the USA declared war with Japan the following day, entering World War II. This, of course, once again created a need for patrol boats, and the USA looked to private yachts once again for this task. On February 17th of 1942, they again requested the Sachem one more time, acquiring it for $65,000. In this service, they again modified it for naval service, arming it to the brim with anti-sub, anti-air, and anti-infantry equipment and rechristening it as the USS Finnegate. This ship was a training, escort, and patrol vessel, and it was part of the Fleet Sonar School Squadron, where sailors were trained on sonar and other equipment for the duration of the war, being officially decommissioned and placed out of service at Hopkinsville in October of 1945, transferring the boat to the Maritime Commission for disposal just 3 days after. But again, lucky for the ship, Captain Jake bought it back for about $5,300 and again named it the Sachem in December of 1945. The ship at this point was in pretty poor shape. It was left without necessary attention while it was in service, and good old Jake didn't have the money to restore it to a fishing vessel again, thus having to put it up for sale and selling it to Circle Line Sightseeing Cruises of New York, who acquired and renamed the ship the Sightseer, adding it to their collection of sightseeing yachts that they'd take tourists on through the New York waterways. Eventually, this company even named the boat the Circle 5, pictured here, and only removed this boat from their fleet in 1977 after 31 years of service. At this point, the boat was sold for scrap and was stripped of all of its useful components. A few organizations cared for this boat, trying their best to preserve it following this, but it was almost forgotten despite this, until one, Robert Butch Miller, a Funtown, Ohio businessman, bought it for $7,500, and over the course of 10 days, moved it out of the muddy Hudson Bay with bulldozers back into the water, repairing it and docking it illegally, or maybe just as a pirate, aka he wasn't paying private businesses to dock it at their docks, and he did this for months to avoid fees. As is kind of a trend I've seen with boat owners in these stories, he didn't have much money despite buying a boat. Now, after this, in part due to theft of supplies from the boat, including tools, and in part because Butch was driving from Cincinnati to New York and New Jersey weekly, he thought he could repair the craft much more easily if he just moved it down to Cincinnati. So he decided what he'd do is sail the ship up New England's coast, then down the St. Lawrence River to get to Cincinnati. And he tried to do just that. He set up a dang lawn chair on the upper deck as the helm, and he tied a broomstick to the propulsion controls below him, and was able to operate and steer the Sachem at 2 to 8 knots, navigating it, well, not very far at first. He actually ended up grounding the boat in the fog, and he had to tow it back to the harbor where it sat for another year. But in the following year, Butch undertook a 2,600-mile journey from New York to Cincinnati, taking the Hudson River through the Erie Canal and the Great Lakes, then into Chicago, and down the Mississippi to the Ohio River, something referred to as the Great Loop. This voyage took him 40 days, And in winter of 1988, Butch Miller finally parked the vessel outside of the tributary that flowed into his plot from the Ohio River. This tributary was technically in Kentucky. Now, sadly, the following year, the Ohio River's water levels went down, and sediment accumulated, and the ship was run aground in the muddy bed of the tributary. He didn't have money to spend to get the boat towed out, nor could he restore it further, and Miller moved on to other projects, retiring away from Cincinnati and selling the land to neighbors. Now, as sad as it is, this sort of marks the end for the tale of the ship. In 2013, a news article about it did go viral, so briefly the ship became an internet icon. This is how we know about the ship and the lore around it, and it also led a lot of people to visit it. It's worth noting this ship is on private property, and it's technically illegal to visit it. Not just technically, it is illegal to visit it. But despite this, people visit it from far and wide. It's also worth noting there is a group of people that want to restore the ship. If you want to join this group of people, you're welcome to donate to their cause at the website listed on the screen, USS So the other day, I was on Reddit, scrolling through the state subreddit for Kentucky, as I do for these videos, and I found a post that piqued my interest. It was made about 9 months ago, and it was titled, "Does anyone remember Guntown Mountain?" After which I was hit with a flood of nostalgia for a place I'd visited in the 90s as a wee kid. A place I remembered as simultaneously amazing, but also terribly run. It was an amusement attraction in Cave City, Kentucky, and it was love at first sight for me. I knew I had to cover it. But then I came across a comment that redirected me. At first I thought I'd be writing a story telling you the lore of an abandoned theme park that I'd visited as a child, and I sort of am, but more interesting perhaps is the tale of a business owner suffering from a mental illness that decided to act out his grandiose ideas during a vulnerable period in his life. For the record, I wish this business owner nothing but success in the future, as it seems this story is less a reflection of who he chooses to be and more a function of what this disease confronted him with. Regardless, to tell you the history of this amusement park, it's relatively simple, honestly. This park opened, at first, in 1969 as Guntown Mountain, which was basically a sort of Wild West attraction nestled near Mammoth Cave National Park in Cave City, Kentucky. There were rides, there were slides, there were shows with cowboys, there were public hangings, which isn't very kid-friendly. There was a ski lift that took you 10 feet above the ground as you went up a mountain without restraints on it. You get the gist. It was essentially a tourist destination, albeit from accounts I'm seeing on Reddit and my own account, maybe a dangerous one. And this was aimed mostly at younger folks. And through to the early 2010s, this spot remained relatively popular. But it sadly closed in 2013 after 43 years of fun and games in the hills of Kentucky. But then, in 2015, something interesting happened. One individual named Will Russell, the founder of Lebowski Fest, you might have heard of it, and the former owner of Y Louisville Novelty Shops, was in the middle of a manic episode thrust upon him by a mental illness he suffered from. And this illness, combined with some substance abuse issues, and suddenly he decided he was going to buy the rundown Guntown Mountain, a dilapidated amusement park in Cave City, Kentucky near Mammoth Cave National Park, as I've mentioned. Anyways, this business owner, mid-mania, was just like, I'm buying it. And he announced that in 2.5 months, Guntown Mountain would be open on social media. Now, the catch here that I should note is the fact that when he made this announcement, he did not own it yet. After his announcement, of course, he approached the then owner, who really didn't want to sell the land, and this individual apparently asked an insane amount of money for the area that was Guntown Mountain, to which Russell, for some reason, accepted. It seems he's not even sure of the reason he accepted this, but I imagine this was to the surprise of the then owner. Anyways, Russell went on to get a $250,000 loan and started a Kickstarter and even did some local fundraising using the reputation he'd built as a business owner to acquire money to start up this fun park. It's probably worth noting at this point, Russell had issues with mental illness in the past. This wasn't the first time he'd dealt with this issue in his life. The thing is, he'd just not been a well-known business owner at the time of his first bout with mania, so when he got arrested and kind of went crazy in public, nobody really cared. Also, in an article I'm reading, in a way it seemed he considered his mental illness a gift in some respects, as it lent him energy, ambition, and creativity. This actually, by his account, lent him the energy he needed to accomplish many of the projects he'd completed in the past. And hey, good on him for recognizing this. Perhaps at first he viewed the reopening of this attraction as just that, a stroke of genius rather than mania. Now, the opening of Funtown Mountain, as he planned to call it, was not cheap, and it was accompanied by his idea of promoting it with a traveling circus that toured the country, known as the Carnival of Fun Roadshow, which, FYI, was extremely expensive to run, and never sold enough tickets along its 20-state journey to promote Funtown Mountain. From what I could tell, it cost them at least tens of thousands of dollars that it didn't earn back. Regardless, in 2015, they had a Grand Awesoming, which was their version of a grand opening, and at first the venture appeared to be doing well. That is until Russell started to act out in front of customers and employees, apparently having fits in public. Apparently, given his state at the time of the story, opening an amusement park was a bigger bite than he could chew, and he admits his behavior wasn't necessarily acceptable. In addition to having fits in public, he was apparently very into himself at the time and kind of egotistical due to his condition. But despite this, he remained all in on making this amusement park thrive. And at first, as I mentioned, it looked like he might have made it. A lot of things were looking up, even though he was having some issues. Social media, for instance, for Funtown Mountain, exploded around the time it opened, and the media was having a field day with the whole reopening of the park. But then, as I've mentioned, substance abuse kicked in again, and he decided to stop taking his meds, and suddenly he lost a grip on reality. And before he knew it, he was painting his car and his house, and, well, maybe better put, he was throwing paint at his car and his house. And then he shaved his head, and then he spray painted the front of his Y Louisville stores and parts of the Funtown Mountain Park. And he actually told locals on social media to come to his stores and Funtown Mountain and take anything they wanted, literally anything, that all of it was free. He was apparently also walking around in public with a guitar and singing to people that didn't want anything to do with him. From what I can tell, Funtown Mountain didn't even last through September of 2015, so about 2 months, closing after Russell's manic episode culminated in Russell being jailed in Hart County, as he experienced a delusion about making a movie with Jennifer Lawrence. During his arrest, he apparently asked the police if they'd join him in this movie. And after being released, he was given antipsychotics and sent away for treatment for about 30 days. Following this, it was not good for him either. He'd gotten his mind back, but at the cost of his home, his business, and even some of the rights to visit his daughter. He was spiraling because of this, and kind of almost took his own life, but the thought of his daughter is apparently what kept him from doing this, and Russell eventually turned around for the better. He got through it, as we get through everything in life with time, and as of today, he's started another business, a nonprofit called the Everything Will Be Okay Project, a nonprofit aimed to help normalize the topic of mental health, and he's done his best to make amends to all of the people he kind of threw under the bus during the Guntown Mountain ordeal. From what I can tell, in 2021, Guntown Mountain reopened once again as Guntown Mountain this time. This time it was a bit more successful as it ran for a couple of years, but ultimately it again closed in 2023. This time maybe for good, but who knows what the future holds for Guntown Mountain. All I have to say is, wowzers, I didn't expect a story like this when I was revisiting a place that I held dear in my childhood. But what I do have to say is, Mr. Russell, I wish you all the best. I hope that your new nonprofit works out well, and I hope that you're feeling great. Now, if you know me, you know I love a good tacky roadside attraction, and in Lexington, Kentucky, you'll find just that. Because if you drive through the north side of town, you'll be met with the sight of a gigantic Dixie cup floating in the sky. This Dixie cup's history actually follows an influx of manufacturing to Lexington in the 1940s and 50s, part of which included the Dixie Cup factory, which immediately built this water tower in the shape of a Dixie cup in 1958, as I guess a sort of advertisement to itself. This structure stands at the corner of Mercer and Harbison Roads, and today can still be seen standing there as a guiding beacon of light in the sky. Now, I'm not sure if it's still in use. In terms of holding water, I sort of doubt it, but when it was constructed, it was estimated that this giant metal Dixie cup held about 40,000 gallons of water. Additionally, when Georgia Pacific acquired the Dixie Company in 2000, there was some talk internally about whether the water tower would be torn down, even planning to do so, but the city of Lexington actually pretty much demanded that GP keep it there, as it's used as a point of reference for the nearby airport, so in that respect, it remains helpful to them. Because of that, and that alone I guess, today you can still see this Dixie cup in the night sky of Lexington, Kentucky. Kentucky, it's been a treat learning more about you, and I hope that I did your weird folklore justice. Look, next I was planning on moving on to Indiana, but if you have an idea in mind for a video after that, I want you to shout it out in the comments. Tell me. Upvote each other and everything. The loudest voice will win in this specific instance. And after that, for the winner, we're going to move on to places that are warm. Anyways, with all of this in mind, I just want to say thank you all for watching and remind you that whether you just saw a train and a UFO smack into each other while you were walking on the railroad tracks, or if your head suddenly got filled with the uncontrollable urge to buy an amusement park, don't you ever forget, it's always story time. Methemoglobinemia. Methemoglobinemia.